Baptism and Foot Washing, More Than Symbols, by Kim Papaioannou. Kim Papaioannou, Doctor of Philosophy, pastor in Cyprus. Seventh-day Adventist theology defines both baptism and foot washing, quote, the ordinance of humility, end quote, as symbols. With symbols, the real essence is found not so much in the symbols themselves, but in the realities they represent. Symbolism is, without question, integral to both baptism and foot washing. But do they involve more than just symbolism? In the New Testament, both ordinances signified cleansing from sin. They rendered a person clean. That dimension, acknowledged in the Adventist statement of faith, was much more pronounced than Christians today realize. To gain a better understanding of the original context of both practices, we will A. Explore Jewish attitudes toward ritual purity in the first century, B. Examine certain New Testament incidents in the life of Jesus, as well as C. Incidents in the early church in which ritual purity forms an important background, D. And see how the New Testament language of baptism and foot washing highlight the cleansing function of both ordinances. We will close our study with some observations for our modern setting. Jewish attitudes toward purity. To 21st century Christians, the idea of ritual purity sounds strange, though less so to those who have lived in Muslim countries. But to first century Jews, it was paramount. They attained ritual purity through three practices: a purity pyramid that ensured a person was always clean. By far, the most important was circumcision. Rabbis considered it the greatest sacrifice, one made in the flesh. Thus it rendered a person clean, while the uncircumcised were unclean. The purity pyramid layers. At the foundation, circumcision. In the center, sacrifices. At the top, foot washings. Paul makes a veiled reference to this when he states, quote, "We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners," end quote. The phrase, quote, "by birth," end quote, in this verse is a translation from the Greek phusei, which describes a person's natural status, quote, "by nature," end quote, cf. KJV's, quote, "by nature," end quote, received through circumcision. Paul therefore contrasts Gentiles, who are, quote, "sinners," end quote, uncircumcised/unclean, and circumcised Jews who no longer are. The apostle does not condone this perspective, but simply acknowledges it. He then proceeds to offer an alternative, which we will explore below. Next in importance were sacrifices. They were difficult to perform, especially for Jews living in the diaspora. They were usually offered during the designated pilgrimage because they required travel to Jerusalem. The third level of the pyramid was ritual washings. The most important was the mikvah, immersing oneself in a pool of water. Baptism most likely developed from the mikvah. Required of proselytes joining the Jewish faith, it was also available to Jews who wanted purification. Smaller mikvaot were enough for one person. Larger pools could accommodate more and often had two sets of steps, one leading down and one for going back up, to keep the purified ascending individuals from touching those descending who were still impure. The most famous mikvah was the Pool of Siloam, situated downhill from the temple, where pilgrims could purify themselves before ascending to the temple. The ritual washing of hands, nipto or baptizo in the Greek text, was common. because a ritually pure person might accidentally touch a defiled person or thing and thus incur defilement. Mark adds, quote, "And there are many other traditions that they, Jews, observe, such as the washing, baptismos, of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches." Circumcision provided statutory purity, while sacrifices and washings restored purity once compromised. Although the concept had a biblical foundation, Jewish tradition had greatly embellished it. Jewish purity laws and the ministry of Jesus. When Jesus offered a visit to a centurion's home to heal a servant, the official objects because he is, quote, "not worthy," end quote. Being a Roman, he was uncircumcised and therefore perceived as unclean. Aware of Jewish sensitivities, he seeks to prevent Jesus from entering his home. In Luke 15, verse 2, the Pharisees complain that Jesus, quote, "eats," end quote, sunestio, with sinners. They were not concerned with moral defilement, however, but ritual. Quote, "Sinners," end quote, were the ones who did not follow purity laws, and one therefore became defiled through such close social interaction. When a sinful woman anoints Jesus' feet, Simon the Pharisee reasons, quote, "If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner," end quote. Simon was not worried about immorality, because it cannot be transferred through touch, but ritual defilement could, or so the rabbis taught. Hence Simon's syllogism. During Jesus' trial, Jews did not want to enter Pilate's hall, because doing so would result in ritual defilement and make them unable to partake of the Passover meal. Showing little regard for such traditions, Jesus compared Pharisees to tombs, clean on the outside, but full of defilement on the inside. Thus, he made it clear that inner moral purity is much more important than outer ritual purity. Jewish purity laws and the early church. The early church did not have the same theological clarity as Jesus did. When invited to Cornelius' house, Peter hesitates, quote, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation," end quote. To convince him otherwise, God shows him a vision of a sheet with, quote, "all kinds of animals," end quote. That is, both clean and unclean. When told to eat, Peter replies, quote, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean," end quote. The word unclean refers to animals forbidden by God. Common applies to animals that were clean according to Leviticus 11, but considered defiled or common by rabbinic thinking because of their proximity to something unclean. Quote, "What God has made clean, do not call common," end quote, the angel explains. The being never tells Peter to eat unclean animals, but only those that were clean, but which rabbinic tradition declared defiled or common. The vision convinces Peter to visit Cornelius, realizing that he will not be defiled by it. After the incident, Jewish Christians confront Peter, quote, "You went to uncircumcised men and ate synestio with them," end quote. And it is the same accusation directed at Jesus when he ate with sinners. Peter later explains, quote, "God made no distinction between us and them, having cleansed, kathariso, their hearts by faith," end quote. Cleansed is a ritual term. The Jewish Christians had complained that Peter had eaten with uncircumcised, i.e. unclean, persons. But Peter replies that God had, quote, "cleansed," end quote, the uncircumcised through faith. The cleansing God provides is far greater than that of circumcision. it leads Peter to utter a most profound, for a Jew, statement. Quote, "We shall be saved in the same manner as they." End quote. While Gentiles do not require the cleansing that circumcision was thought to offer, Jews did need the cleansing God provides through faith. Paul and Peter face a similar accusation in Antioch. Despite Peter's noble response in the Cornelius incident, here he falters. Quote, "Peter was eating, synestheo, with the Gentiles, but when they, men from James, came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party." End quote. The, quote, "circumcision party," end quote, were Jewish Christians who still thought circumcision conferred ritual purity. The issue at Antioch was not what Peter and Paul were eating, as some mistakenly assume, but the circumcised were eating with the uncircumcised. While Peter caved in under pressure, Paul stood firm. Paul declares that believers are justified by faith. The word justified has the same force as the word cleansed, the difference being that justified is a legal term, whereas cleansed is a ritual one. Like Peter in Acts 15 verses 9 through 11, Paul emphasizes that true purity stems from faith in Jesus, not from circumcision, sacrifices, and ritual washings. Baptism and foot washing as purity ordinances. It is against this backdrop that the New Testament presents baptism and foot washing. When Ananias visits Paul immediately after his Damascus Road experience, he tells him, quote, "Rise and be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on his name." End quote. To the Ephesians, Paul declares, quote, "Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church, and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word." End quote. Paul calls baptism, quote, "the washing of regeneration," end quote. And Hebrews 10:22 summons us to approach God with, quote, "hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and bodies washed with pure water," end quote. The words wash/washing, clean/cleansed, and pure carry ritual connotations. The apostle used ritual language to develop the theology of baptism. Indeed, the Greek word baptizo/baptismos are also used of ritual washings. The apostles understood baptism as a ritual of purity. More important are Jesus' words at the Last Supper, when he endeavors to wash Peter's feet. The disciple initially refuses. Quote, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me," end quote. Jesus replies, "It is extremely unlikely that he would exclude Peter for refusing an ordinance of humility. Much more is at stake here. The issue is purity. If Peter does not have his feet washed, he remains in defilement. It is such defilement that can bar him from Jesus' presence." Peter immediately agrees to the foot washing. Jesus then makes the following amazing statement, quote, "The one who has bathed does not need to wash, except for his feet, but is completely clean," end quote. Jesus here uses purity language. A person who has bathed, that is, has been baptized, has statutory purity, is clean. As clean as Jews thought a circumcised person was, and even cleaner. What is now needed is foot washing to restore purity in case it has been compromised. Sacrifices and ritual washings are no longer necessary because baptism and foot washing will render a person clean on an ongoing basis. Jesus then adds, quote, "And you are clean, but not every one of you," end quote. Though Judas was probably baptized and had his feet washed, he was still not clean because his heart remained defiled. purity ordinances are effective only in a person who believes, who has been purified in the heart. Cleansing. We saw that first century Judaism was obsessed with ritual purity. It attained it by a series of rituals: circumcision, which provided statutory purity, and sacrifices and ritual washings that restored purity when circumstantial defilement occurred. The early church struggled with this topic. On the one hand, Judaizing Christians wanted to continue with the rituals of purity. On the other hand, the apostles realized that true purity comes through the cleansing sacrifice of Jesus. Both Jesus and the apostles understood baptism and foot washing as purity ordinances, external manifestations of an inner faith, to the point that Jesus warned Peter that he could be excluded from his presence if he refused foot washing. It is the inner faith together with the outward ordinances that declare a person clean before God. What are the implications for Christians today? Some Protestant churches do not practice baptism or see it as of secondary importance, as merely an external rite of little weight. What matters is faith. Most Christians do not practice foot washing. By contrast, the Adventist Church is correct in seeing both ordinances as integral to the life of a believer. What we may need to do is rethink our terminology. Though both symbolize inner realities, they are more than symbols. They are ordinances of cleansing. A believing person who is baptized attains not only membership in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but is formally declared clean in God's presence. And while we can ask for forgiveness every day in our prayers, and it is granted, foot washing functions as a formal event that declares us cleansed once again from any circumstantial defilement, again in the presence of God. The two ordinances, external manifestations of an inner faith understood within their New Testament context, ensure our ongoing status as clean before God. For bibliographical and biblical references on this article, and for much more content for pastors and church leaders, please visit ministrymagazine.org.